Kato, go ahead.
Great, thanks for having me. I'm going to try to take maybe even 30, 35 minutes so that we can have time for questions. And I also know that this is the last of a long day. This is the last talk of a long day. So I guess everybody's is tired there, but let's try to make a good use of your time. So I'm going to talk briefly about discrimination in algorithms, and I'm going to start with something that probably is very familiar for you, but nevertheless, I think it's worth mentioning, which is whether algorithms can discriminate. And I will really, as in most of my talks on discrimination, I encourage you to read this book, Born Free and Equal, by Kasper Lippert Rasmussen from 2013. Why do I encourage you to read this book specifically? Is because the author is really very much oriented to provide a logical description of things and a very formal description of things. And that is really easy to understand by computer scientists specifically, right? So there is like a formal language in which he describes discrimination. And particularly in this case, the description of discrimination is simply treating someone worse than another person, right? So providing a disadvantage to someone in a systematic manner. Then from that, we can jump to group discrimination, which is genetic discrimination, but where the reason why this discrimination is happened is that one of the persons, the person who is treated in a disadvantageous manner, belongs to a socially salient group. Socially salient groups are groups that are very visible, groups to which you belong that are very visible. Like in my case, being Chilean, for instance, and that are important for relationships in society, particularly for relationships of power. And so group discrimination is a particular instance of discrimination, and statistical discrimination is a particular form of group discrimination. And statistical discrimination is based on a statistical belief. So it's not, so the person who is discriminating believes that Y and not zeta has a particular property that is statistically relevant, right? Or believes, or either the property is really there or there is a belief that the property is there. So for instance, the typical example of a statistical versus non-statistical discrimination is this one, where if a recruiter decides not to hire a highly qualified woman because the recruiter believes that women are more likely to take parental leave, then the recruiter is engaging in a statistical discrimination because it's based the discrimination on a statistics, on a statistical belief. Now, if the woman says, I intend to take parental leave, then that's no longer a statistical, that's simply based on an observation, right? Now, there is always this question, okay, can an algorithm discriminate? And I say, yes, definitely yes. An algorithm described through statistical machine learning can discriminate. How? By engaging in a statistical discrimination. And why? Because a machine learning algorithm, a learning to rank algorithm, any of these algorithms that you probably discussed today, all of those are based on extracting statistically relevant information from data. And hence everything they know are statistical beliefs. And hence, like if they produce a disadvantageous treatment to some group, the algorithm is engaging in a statistical discrimination. A different thing is, okay, who is accountable for that, right? Now, I'm going to talk to you about, to set the stage, a little bit about multi-stakeholder recommended system, and then I'm going to go specifically in an audit of a specific app that maybe can be helpful for you, for all of us to understand how an app can be audited for discrimination, right? So in multi-stakeholder information access system, and here I can only recommend the great tutorial by Michael Extra, Fernando Diaz, and Richard Burke on fair information access. They have given it in several editions, including one in CIR. In a multi-stakeholder information access system, you have these producers or content that have a corpus or inventory of content, right? Music, movies, postings, news, etc. And there are some consumers of this information, right? And typically in multi-sided recommendation or multi-stakeholder recommendation, you have either you have multiple parties, right? But typically you have some reciprocal recommendations. For instance, a dating app is a typical case of reciprocal recommendation, right? You want a recommendation that is, everybody is a user, but also everybody is an item for some reason, right? So then you want to recommend people in a mutually satisfactory manner. Now, but when you have two sides, like really two sides, like a consumer side and a producer side, then we are talking about consumer fairness, and producer fairness normally, and then fairness to the platform, which is less relevant for our discussion. So consumer fairness is what is the disparate effect of recommendations on the different people who are receiving the recommendations, right? So there are they equally benefit? Do they equally benefit from the recommendation? Do they find the same type of quality, the same type of relevance, do they get the same kind of satisfaction from the recommender system? And then do they pay the same cost? So are they doing longer sessions? Are they paying a steeper price, and so on? So all these questions are related to fairness from the side of consumers in a multi-stakeholder recommender system or information access system. For generality, right? Now, producer fairness is more like the concern that things are fair for the people who are producing the content or that offering a service. So for instance, if you have a service selling, intermediating the sales of crafts, or selling or music streaming, a music streaming service, or even a job search platform. There are many cases, many different cases here. You want the different producers to have equal benefits, right? So equal visibility, equal number of transactions, equal revenue on expectations, and so on, and also to pay similar costs, right? So not to pay different participation fees, transaction fees, and so on, or even effort, right? That they don't need to put wildly different effort to achieve the same results. Now, in some domains, interestingly, these types of fairness are regulated, at least partially by law, right? And the fact that this happens on the internet doesn't mean, of course, that the laws don't apply there, right? So employment and housing are the two areas in which there are some regulation of this. And there are, of course, like this requires to try to understand how to operationalize those regulations, right? So what does it mean to prevent discrimination on the basis of gender, for instance? What does it mean specifically? And that's where audits kind of enter the picture. And what to make things even more complicated, the problem is that there are some cases in which there are more than two stakeholders. Right. So in the case of books, you have publishers, right? So you have the authors, you have the stores, and so on. So there are many more stakeholders in this system. Now, something that typically derails discussions about fairness in information access is a very narrow focus on the issue of merit, right? So is this news really worth being shown? Is this music really worth being listened to, and so on? And those questions are usually quite frequent, but they also really lead to nowhere. And I think more important questions are whether your algorithm or the system has some effect on some inequality that is already existing, right? Which is more a question about justice, right? So is it contributing to inequality, or is it contributing to make things more equal for everyone, right? So that's I think it's a much more relevant and even tractable question for an algorithm than whether the algorithm apportions things according to merit. And second, like, who gets to pick the objective function, right? And it's really about, like, to what extent the interests of different stakeholders are represented in this objective function that you are trying to optimize, and who are you optimizing for? And there are many instances in which optimizing for one side is really hurtful, or is really damaging for the other side, right? So it's important, like these two questions, I think, are really much more important than questions about merit. Now let me show you an analysis that of a room rental app. This app is an app that is very popular in Barcelona and London. These are the two largest markets where this app operates, and they have a substantial market share. in the business of connecting people with potential roomies, right? People who can roomies or flatmate. Now I understand in different versions of English this is different, right? But I call them flatmates. Other people call them roommates, but they don't share the same room. They share the same flat, like, or the same apartment. Sorry, in this app, there are listers who are the people who have the rooms, and there are seekers who are people who are seeking to rent a room, and they communicate through this app. Now, we did get permission from the people who developed this app to conduct the audit. And basically what they were doing is that they were doing several iterations of their machine learning model for the matching, particularly for the recommenders, for the listers recommender. That means if you have a room to rent and you want to see potential people who could rent your room, how, in which people should we show it to you, and how, in which order should they be shown? And what we wanted to do is they were trying to optimize for effectiveness, like to several metrics. I will show you which ones. And they were very concerned about whether this contributes to inequalities in, as you know, Barcelona and London and many other cities, the housing market is really the focus of many inequalities. And so it's important to know if this is contributing to those. So in terms of a funnel of there is a funnel where the lister first has a set of qualifying profiles, right? So these are people who are, the lister has a room in Barcelona, and the qualifying profiles will be people who are looking for a room in Barcelona. Then there are algorithms that will produce set of recommendations, and the lister will look at those recommendations and decide to send a request to some people. A request is like an initial message to tell, okay, I see you're interested in my room, or in a room in Barcelona. Here is the room that we are offering. Let's talk. And then the seeker will decide whether to respond, to answer or not to this message by the lister. Now, we considered two conditions. One was to simply select a random subset of the people who qualify for the room, like potential people who could rent this room. And the treatment condition was recommendation based on machine learning. And they tested several recommender systems. Interestingly, they have even the same learning scheme, but trying to optimize three different things, right? So whether the lister will click on the result and contact the seeker, whether the seeker will answer back, and whether eventually this will lead to renting the flat. We examined 4.2 million recommendations during a 2.5-year period, and with one random model and 5 machine learning models. So the first interesting message here is that the baseline model, which is a random subset of recommendations, has a conversion rate of around 20%, 19%. But the best model, which was XGBoost optimized for responses, has a conversion rate of 35%. And indeed, like all of the machine learning model performs either slightly better or substantially better than the baseline. This means that in this particular setup, it's good to be smart in the way in which you select the profiles to show to the users. Right? You get an increase in the conversion rate if you use a machine learning model. So from the point of view of effectiveness, we would say, okay, let's go for this XGBoost model, optimizing for responses, right? But any of the models would be better than simply showing random recommendations. Now, what we did, then comes a point of measuring fairness, right? And measuring fairness is difficult because there are many potential metrics that you can use. My advice is to use several of them. Some of them are highly correlated, but so you have to pick some that are kind of measuring different parts. And we measure click-through rate, we measure exposure, which means like what's the probability that when you're looking for a room, you will be shown to someone who has a room to offer, and so on. And we group people, and this is another part of like a discrimination audit, is that you tend to group people, you need to group people in certain groups, right? The platform did not allow for other gender, but it allowed for male and female. There are age groups, languages, like Spanish, English, and Italian are the majority language in Barcelona. and then others. And then we also look for profiles that somehow includes gay-friendly keywords like gay-friendly, LGBT, and so on in the description, right? Because there are certain both rooms and people looking for a room that self-declare that they would rather go to a place that is gay-friendly. So the key finding of this exercise was to determine that the machine learning based, as I said, they are better than random, but they do not benefit everyone equally, right? So there is an increase in the, for instance, here is the click-through rate of the model minus the click-through rate of the baseline. And you can see that this affects different groups similarly, right? So if you're a baby boomer, like meaning like a person born in the 70s or earlier, then you will not benefit so much from this model. This is the best model. You are better. You are equally better. You're equally satisfied if you're using the random model or the baseline. If you're looking for a gay-friendly place, then you definitely receive the higher benefit, and different groups receive different benefit. And interestingly, the group of people who have their listing in other languages other than English, Spanish, and Italian. For instance, there are many listings in Arabic in Barcelona because there is a large Arabic-speaking population. Those are worse off with the machine learning model. They will be better off by showing a random subset of flats instead of rooms, instead of like trying to be smart about that. This is another visualization of this in a similar way, right? So we see how the improvement is for different models, and we see that in some cases a model can improve, like be above 0, meaning better than the baseline for one group, but be worse than the baseline for another group. And in this case, we see that many of the methods really hurt listers who are looking at rooms for in other languages other than English, Spanish, and Italian. We also measured inequality of income on average, and we saw that this was not a disparate effect of this particular system, right? We saw that in general, this doesn't lead to different prices overall. It just leads to different exposure, and that probably means how long you have to spend time, how long you have to be in the platform for you to find a room, for instance, right? It's important that this is part of machine learning model quality, and hence, like part of what we are trying to learn here, part of what we're trying to show is that in general, like machine learning model quality requires to look at a number of factors, and in this case, fairness is one of those factors, right? So maybe can I take questions at this point, perhaps, and before I go to the next topic?
Any question on the room? Oh, yeah, you go ahead. Yeah, we have one question.
Hi, just a clarification question. So the recommendations here are basically not self-declared by the user. Like, it's not like when I search and then I do advanced search and then I add a couple of things, like I want it to be gay friendly, I want it to be in an Arab speaking area. So here you're talking, if we study the profile and then we recommend based on it, as opposed to someone declaring I want these things.
Thank you. Yes, that you're right. Your interpretation is correct. So these are in the profile, people say I'm 45 or I'm 25 or I speak Arabic or I want a place that is gay friendly. So these are already declared. So there is no real search. It's more like show me some people who can rent my room, and that's the search basically. It's a recommender system.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks you.
And I have a question. Maybe I could save it for the end, but let me do it now. So what I see on the plot is that the more the user specifies the preferences, and preferences indicated as like the features of my features, like how I am. Let's call it like I am the query. The features is like how I am, say, in this particular case. The better the model can recommend whatever I want, therefore the conversion. So I wonder if the fairness would be better calculated with the counterfactual here, which is as the conversion wouldn't have happened if I wouldn't have like specified my, I don't know, keywords or whatever it is, which I guess in this application is impossible to do because we don't have the counterfactual data. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Right. It would be something like if assuming that that there is no, for instance, there is no declaration about my language, or that there is no declaration of my age or my gender. You're thinking something like that?
Exactly.
You're right. So yeah, so we didn't test that condition, but I think it's like that would be like some people call it like an aware condition or the colorblind condition, where you don't take into account this feature. I think it's important to test it. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the data set, but very likely it's going to be difficult. But just a thought. Okay, so please go ahead.
No, great point. Thank you. So, okay, the next piece is about homophily and link-based recommendations. So this is until the end of my talk in like 14 minutes, 15 minutes, I will tell you a little bit more about homophily and recommendations, right? So this is a study on recommender systems that recommend people to follow, right? Which is a big, important characteristic of many social networking sites. And what we do is that we empirically analyze the effect of homophily on various recommender systems that recommend you people. And I think this is motivated by the following setup, right? So suppose you have two networks, network A and network B. In both networks, the red group, imagine the red groups are whatever, users younger than 20 years old, like between 18 and 20, right? So they are very young users and they are a minority in the graph. In the first network, they are well connected to other users, but in the second network, they are strongly homophilic, right? So they mostly connect to users in their same age group or in the same group in general. Now, when you pass this through a recommender system, then the recommendations that you obtain are different, and indeed one of the main differences that they have is that if a group is highly homophilic, then that group tends to be recommended more. In this particular recommender system, which is a simple preferential attachment recommender. Basically, it will show you the friend of your friend who has the most connections. And this will lead to a recommendation that will heavily favor the red group, even when the red group is a minority, because the red group is highly homophilic. So we used several data sets for this research. There is 20, which is a defunct online social network in Spain. Then there is Pokek, which is a Slovenian network. And we considered several variations of what will be a minority and a majority, right? So we took in some cases very young users, young, like older than 18, but young, for instance, people younger than 21 in 20 or Pokek, and or a minority of older users or a minority of women users and so on, depending on the network, looking for cases where the minority was homophilic or the majority was homophilic and so on. So this is like real data with real homophilic behavior, right? So for instance, in the case of young users in these networks, young users do tend to be heavily homophilic, right? So most of their friends of a young user in these platforms will be another young user, right? Young meaning between 18 and 21 years old. And we tested several recommended algorithms that correspond to somehow different, you could say, prototypes or frameworks for recommendations, right? So of course, baseline will be a random friend of a friend, a method based on random walks, a method based on magic factorization, and a method based on common friends, right? Now, what we did find was that, as the motivating example says, in graphs that have a homophilic minority, then there is an increase in visibility for that minority. If the minority is not homophilic, then this increase doesn't happen, right? We look for delta V will be a positive number, indicating that proportionally to the size of the minority is more visible than the majority. Visible will be the number of times it's recommended, right? So this will be the number of times it is recommended divided by the size of the minority. And this will be for the majority, right? And we will look at whether these coefficients are different. And in the case, in this case, this minority is not homophilic, and actually they have like less visibility, but for minorities that are heavily homophilic, then they have higher visibility. Now, if you consider only the use, this is the visibility of users that are in the top decile in terms of degree. And this set of users actually is the one that benefits the most from this increase in visibility, right? So the disparate visibility that is apportioned to minority users is strongly focused on the group of users that have the most connections. And if we look at these visibility curves, where the diagonal will mean that everybody gets like the same share of visibility, these are Gini curves. The solid curves are the disparate degree of the uses, and then the dashed curves are the disparate visibility that is apportioned by the recommender system. And in most of the cases, as we said, like there is, of course, inequality by degree. You all know, like in online social networks, there are power law distributions of the degree, but this is even more exaggerated when you look at the visibility apportioned by a recommended system. The same happens like can be observed across various metrics. So basically, like what we are looking is that recommended systems are affected heavily by homophily, and probably by other factors in the network, right? But homophily definitely plays a role, and the relative size of the minority doesn't have such a strong effect, right? I think this is important because if you consider an online social network or a platform where you have a group of users that are very well coordinated and they follow each other and they're very connected, even when that set of users may be small in comparison to the rest of the users, the fact that they are homophilic has a strong effect on the visibility that they are given in the platform using all of these different types of recommender systems. Of course, a whom to follow recommender system today is much more complex than this, but we conjecture that they probably have the same problems because they are based on similar paradigms of recommendation. So this means that the network is kind of exposed to be somehow attacked in the sense of like obtaining more visibility than deserved somehow by a small minority, as long as they are very homophilic. Now, when we submitted this paper, one reviewer says, yeah, but what happens over time, right? And that motivated the next paper, actually, which is about feedback loops in recommendation. And here what we do is that through simulation, we consider a scenario in which we have a social network, do some recommendations of users to follow. People accept some of the recommendations or reject them, but in some systematic manner. And then the social network is updated and we execute the same recommended system again. So the conjecture was that, the hypothesis was that if you repeat this process, you may lead to like, maybe things stabilize, right? So there are various hypotheses, but you could think that maybe things stabilize, or maybe the things get run away, and then you have runaway effects. I mean, what I mean is that things get even worse over time or more unequal, whatever, right? So what we performed was about 20 rounds in which 20% of the users of the network receive a recommendation, and we gave each user 3 recommendations. And we used a semi-synthetic generator in which we took a real network, but we performed some swappings or rewirings of links so that we have a minority of the desired size and an homophily of the desired strength, right? So we started with 20, which is our Spanish social network, and then we generated several configurations by swapping some users and swapping some links so that we have a homophilic minority, a homophilic group, a heterophilic minority, and two homophilic groups, right? So different configurations. And again, we use the same types of paradigms of recommendation that we used before. Now, we did consider different ways in which users could react to this recommendation, right? So we have, we call it a lazy user who simply accepts the first recommendation the user is given. A random user who takes the top K recommendations and pick one at random, and then a probability-based user, a probability-biased user that will take the first recommendation with more probability than the second or the third, and then some mixture of these strategies of user behavior, right? So in all cases, we assume that the user somehow follows the recommendations because we do observe that this is something that happens in networks, right? So they have this organic growth, but they are also like part of the growth is driven by the recommendations, definitely. So not surprisingly, when you have a minority that is homophilic, this disparate exposure increases over time. And depending on the model of recommendation, this increase can be very dramatic and continue forever, or I mean, continue for a long time, or not, right? So, for instance, this matrix factorization based recommender was particularly sensitive to a strong, to a homophilic that was strongly, sorry, to a minority that was strongly homophilic. And it continued giving and giving and giving more exposure to this group over time. And like the way in which this changes is different for different recommender systems, like either giving a lot of visibility immediately and then continuing increasing, or doing it slowly over time. We also change the initial configurations a little bit. Like we played around like different like degrees of homophily and different sizes of the minority. And our observation from here is that like how homophilic is the minority impacts at which speed this minority gains links. And the size of the minority determines the severity of this effect, right? So both a minority can gain by either getting a bit larger, which will make the effect stronger, or simply being more homophilic, which will make this happen faster, right? So in both cases, the minority will benefit from an increase of a continued increase of exposure as the recommender system is executed and people follow the recommendations. I also can tell you that that indeed, like as in the other case, the fraction of nodes, the nodes that are in the top decile by degree. So for instance, here, the yellow nodes, the yellow bars represents the nodes that are in the 1% of larger degree in the network. And those are the ones that benefit the most from this increased visibility. And then nodes that have a smaller degree, they benefit less. But this we knew already from the one iteration case. In multiple iteration, this continues to hold. Now, we did show also in this research that if you have different user behavior models, they don't impact the process as much as simply the homophily of the groups when they begin, right? So all these things like picking the first recommendation, picking the first recommendation with more probability than the second, picking a random recommendations among the top K, all of them more or less lead to the same effect, right? And so basically, this different link-based recommended system, they generate an increasing exposure for the minority, and this increasing exposure is worse when you iterate, right? Of course, we didn't try a network that was growing or a more sophisticated model of user behavior that may change these conclusions, right? So what I can say for concluding and before taking more questions is that in general, information retrieval and recommender systems have arrived a little bit late to this discussion on fairness, right? So a little bit late, but already several years now. But this discussion started in machine learning and data mining, and I think there is much more material on those fields that in information retrieval and recommender system. There is still like a lot to do here. There are many open problems for research. Sometimes they involve solving an interesting algorithmic puzzle. Sometimes they don't, right? So sometimes it's just a matter of starting to do some metrics, doing some simulations and trying to understand how things work in practice, which I think is very important and complements very well the more theoretical studies. I can recommend you the different things, but there is I can recommend you a lot this fairness in ranking survey by Meike, Yang, and Stojanovic. That is in ACM Computing Surveys and speaks about fair rankings. So really, really interesting thing to read. Okay, I conclude now, and I will take more questions about this second part.
Thank you. Questions in the room? I have, or in the Zoom call, if you have a question, please use the hands tool or directly write in the chat. Have questions. So in computing homophily, what features are we talking about? So when we're saying, so you're talking about, you were talking about age groups. In these studies are the only dimensions, like what dimensions are you? And my question goes towards problematic homophily, for example, single point of view, hate speech, kind of, homophily driven approach versus generational, or what kind of what kind of study, what are we talking about in terms of
interesting? That's interesting. Yeah. So somehow I was hinting at hinting at like this could be a political group, right, or an ideological group trying to polarize the network, but we didn't test it.
But it could be, and that's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, I think it could be, but it's not what we tested for. We tested with so first we do know that these coordinated ideologically driven groups, they are highly homophilic, right? This is very visible every time one draws for instance, a network of political affinity between people. We find that the people connect the most. People are highly homophilic in terms of politics, right? Anyone who has drawn like a Democrats versus Republican, either books or blogs or pages, like this is very visible. So these groups are homophilic, but we did test only with age groups and with gender groups, and we did find that age groups were particularly homophilic in the network.
From I have been saying this all day, yeah. From an industry point of view, I think one motivational factor would be these different types of homophily dimensions. For example, age-driven homophily might seem less harmful than political-based homophily, for example. And my next question would be, how do you solve this, right? I'm not sure if we are too late. You said we are too late and recommender systems. I'm not sure, you can always ask, cost functions in here based on what you just said, but the motivation for an industry-based solution would be, for example, prevent harms or things like that. And then the age angle, I don't think sounds like really harmful, but you let me know. Huh? But,
so one of the things in fair ranking that I think one of the interesting findings, I would say, of fair ranking in general, and this is fine in these surveys, right? Is that in fair ranking you can usually, and in recommender systems the same happen, right? You can usually swap one recommendation by another without losing much. And the same is true for many types of ranking. So even things such as admission to the university, right? So admission to the university or to a high degree postgraduate study is also like you can produce a ranking of candidates, but if you swap the last two candidates, like really nothing happens, right? Because you are not really very able to predict their academic performance in the future. And the same happens with recommender systems, right? So but at that point, you have very noisy estimates of the quality of the recommendation. So in this case, I think this can definitely be mitigated. Like if you like the simplest mitigation will be really post-processing the recommendations. There is this thing called the Rudney rule that is used in professional sports, like in professional football, I think, where you always, if you are interviewing for a coach for a football team, your first interviewer should be a minority candidate, or among your first interviews, you must interview a minority candidate. And here in a recommender system, one can apply something similar and say, well, I'm going to put a recommendation of someone that is from the opposite political sign or from a different age. I'm just going to put it there and see what happens. And in many cases, user will react positively to these recommendations because your estimates are noisy anyway for the other users.
Exactly. So I think we have been discussing this today in several talks about recommending content from the other political spectrum or the other spectrum. Then, maybe approximating that versus like, completely contrarian approaches or completely dissimilar content or, connection recommendation is something that very likely is not going to work. So the challenge here is to find things that are not completely 100% homophily like, but they go a little away from being completely equal, right? Or in the same cluster.
Yeah, absolutely. And also if you're like more like thinking of the application, like the product, right? You're talking about areas of the page that have click-through rates that are single digit and perhaps less than 5% and so on, right? So these are areas where people, you're not sure that what you're giving is really relevant for a user. So given that, like you have a little more of like flexibility to play with those areas. Absolutely.
Makes sense. Any last question? Yeah, one question. Yeah.
Hi, Carlos. This is Arpit.
Hi, Arpit.
Hi. So I have a couple of questions, but depending on the time, we can just do any one of them. One is, do you have any like insights into when the minority groups are defined not based on a single protected attribute, but intersectional? So, for example, a queer woman who is also a person of color, for example. And I suppose the metric for fairness, visibility, whatever, would also not be exactly the same. It would have to be something a little bit more different. Is that the case?
Yeah. So okay. So the question was by Arpit Merkant, like it's a PhD student in Helsinki University, and the like these intersectional groups are really interesting to study. The problem is often the paucity of data, and that really what you're hinting at. Okay, this may require other metrics. I think it's very relevant because sometimes you will find that you have very small groups. Now, this comes a little bit to me, and let me use the question also to speak about mitigation, right? So sometimes here, like the mitigation is no longer an algorithmic mitigation, but somehow, for instance, the thing that these machine learning models are so bad for people who speak other languages here requires probably a different mitigation measure. And perhaps it requires a dedicated area of the app for like finding a flat in Arabic, right? That has its own optimization that is for, and maybe a user interface that is in Arabic and and provides a better service for this particular group that is underserved here, right? So at that point, like especially when the groups start to be smaller and smaller, and I have seen it in other algorithmic audits we have done. For instance, we did one about child protection, and there is a very important minority there, which are children of parents with disabilities, which aren't many. They aren't many, but they are really at a disadvantage when you use a machine learning method to do anything because they are very particular cases, right? Or an intersection like a queer racialized woman, like at that point, like the groups are small and these statistical methods like are no longer the correct tool, in my opinion. And it's more like understanding which are those groups, which are their needs, and whether the app or the system can be modified to serve them better, right? So the mitigation doesn't always need to be algorithmic. I think mitigation has to sometimes come from the different place.
Okay, yeah. So okay, so that makes sense. Which actually kind of also leads to the second question I had, which is, so given that some interventions need not be algorithmic, or some interventions might be, we might need a combination of these two things in various contexts and applications. Um, on a more not a computational level, but at a policy level, is it possible to have governments define regulations and that apply to various companies that require them to define a system that captures everything? So there's some set of criteria. Any algorithmic system that is deployed must have the potential to mitigate algorithmically or non-algorithmically these various harms that may exist. At the same time, then because having regulation is not enough, because the other discrimination comes when it's selectively enforced. Some companies may not get regulated, others may. So
Right. I think this. I think there are levels of regulation. I would say that are required for this to work. There is like a higher level of regulation, which is okay. Somebody needs to perform this audit in a product, right? The very basic one, like just measure what's happening with your product and these different groups, and these are the groups you should measure against. You need to tell us that there is no discrimination by gender, age, and so on, and these are series of characteristics. So that's high level. And then that can be implemented into lower and lower level. And at some point you arrive to industry practices. So I think there is no one size fits all solution in terms of regulation for this. It's more like layers regulation, starting by a requirement to just look at the data and just like do the audit and so on. There are even more basic things, like somebody has to look at this code and ensure, given that this code is impacting housing, somebody has to be able to inspect this code and see that there is no direct discrimination there. So there is no rule harming like people who speak Arabic, for instance, like in this platform, right? So there is even about basic level. So I think there are layers of regulation that can cover this from high level to low level, and the low level will be more quantitative, definitely. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation.